Hi, welcome back. We're continuing with our series of videos on the laws of Shechita. And we are continuing with the place of Shechita on the neck of the animal. Really, we have the entire length of the neck. So if you have a small pigeon, a tiny bird, you have a little bit of area. Whereas if you have a giraffe, you have the entire length of the neck. Of course, there are upper and lower boundaries, which we're going to discuss in a minute. And ideally, you want to shecht in the middle of the neck. That's what the halacha says. So what are the upper boundaries? If you remember, first of all, there are two pipes. There's the windpipe and there's the food pipe. If you're slaughtering a cow or sheep or something like that, you must cut at least most of 51% of the food pipe and the windpipe. Whereas with a bird, you must cut a minimum of 51% of either the food pipe, the trachea, or in Hebrew, the kaneh, or 50%, 51% of the esophagus, which is the veshet in Hebrew, and it's the food pipe that goes down into the stomach. Ideally, you want to cut 100% of both of them. But in a bird, it's sufficient to cut just more than 50% of one of them. So what are the locations? Where are we allowed to shech? So if you feel your own neck, you can feel your Adam's apple, the pointed bit of cartilage there. If you were to cut smack in the middle there, you would see that inside there are two, they call them in Hebrew chitim. They're sort of like grains of rice, and that's about what they look like. And in the air pipe, as long as you've left the slightest bit of those grains of wheat or whatever they look like, they're little bits of cartilage really, as long as you've left the slightest bit left there and you haven't cut above where those two things are, that's the upper boundary in the trachea. The lower boundary, in theory, goes down almost to where the lung is. But in practice, it's not really an issue because you're not going to be cutting down here where there's the chest bone. And the only problem that we ever really face is if we've cut too high up, in which case that's a problem with the trachea. Since, especially in a bird, also in an animal for that matter, the trachea is sort of held firmly here, and the food pipe, the esophagus, is firmly behind it, you almost always slaughter the trachea first. The only difference is in certain small birds, like sparrows or pigeons or things like that. Sometimes those tubes can actually move around, and you have to have a special sort of experience with a particular way to hold those birds. But a standard chicken or something like that, you're going to be, by definition, cutting the trachea first, the kaneh first. So the upper level is, as long as you leave the teeniest bit of those two little bits of cartilage that look like wheat, or down to where it really disappears into the ribs. That's the air pipe. The esophagus, the esophagus where the food goes in. So in an animal, as it goes all the way in, it begins to get a little bit of, like, they call it hair. It's not really hair, but little projections on the inside of that tube. And that's where it becomes forbidden, on the bottom. And on the top, think about it. When you eat, when you open your mouth, all right, the back of your mouth has muscles and has tendons, and it's held open. And at some point, the food begins to go towards the back of your mouth, and it ends up going into the little pipe there, okay? That pipe closes up on itself. If you cut it, and you'll see when we do a shechita, as soon as you try and look at it, you'll see that it sort of shrinks up on itself, and it like sort of closes. That's an area that's okay. But if you cut it so high that you can see that it's sort of a little bit held open, so then you've cut it above where that veshet begins. And on a bird, if you remember, we said that down in the chest here, there's something where the first step of the digestive system starts. It's called the crop, or the zefek in Hebrew. If you see that you've cut it so far down the neck that you've entered the area where that crop is, that's also forbidden. Okay, it's not kosher. But bottom line is, if you learn how to hold the animal, and holding the animal and holding the neck of the animal is a whole study in itself, and it's something that takes a lot of practice. Because think about it for a minute. Here we have our practice bird here. Okay, when I hold the bird, I'm holding the bird like this, and I pull back very tightly around the neck here. Because if I don't pull it back tightly, the skin is loose. And if it's loose, when I try and cut, even with a sharp knife, it'll move. So I have to pull it back very tight. But my fingers have to be below the level of the bone, because the knife is going to cut here like this, okay? And if the knife cuts, when it hits the bone, it's going to stop. But if my fingers are sticking up higher than the bone, what's going to happen? I'm going to cut, and I'm going to cut my fingers. Now, that once happened to me, and just to show you how little pain the animals feel, when I did that, I felt the knife go into my fingers, but it didn't really hurt. It took a good minute for it to start to sting. Within a few seconds, the animals lost consciousness. So I don't really believe that the animals feel any pain or very, very minimal suffering at all. Okay, next, let's keep going. We did that. Ideally, you want to slaughter it in the middle, okay? And if by chance you know how to move those two pipes around, or it's the sort of bird that the pipes can move around, ideally you want to hold the bird such that you're keeping them right here in the center, and that's how you do it. Yeah, everything else I told you. The amount of shechita, well, we said that. The ideal shechita is if you slaughter both of those two pipes completely, 100%. But like we said, in the worst case scenario, if you slaughtered only 51% of one of them in a bird, that's sufficient. 51% of two of them in an animal, and that's sufficient. Okay, in addition to those two pipes, there are two large blood vessels that run along the side of the neck called the carotid arteries. Now, theoretically, we can cut just the windpipe, and even the food pipe, and theoretically, the animal could put its head back down and attach the air pipe. And if the air pipe is attached, there's very little bleeding from the skin itself. Theoretically, the animal could stay alive. So when we do a shechita, for the most part, by definition, because we're going to go back and forth a few times, we cut or nick those blood vessels so the blood comes out and then the animal loses consciousness, okay? But let's say you didn't cut those two blood vessels, but the animal died a slow death, okay? Is there any implications from the halacha? And the answer is the following: that in order to make the animal kosher after you've done a proper slaughter, the animal has to be soaked and salted, and then the salt has to be washed off. And it's a process. We'll teach you how to do that as well. But you're allowed to soak an entire bird without taking the bird apart. Because once the animal's been slaughtered, and if you cut those two vessels, the blood comes out, and there's very little blood left in the animal, and the salting takes the rest of it out. However, if you did not cut those vessels, or you barely cut those vessels, and the animal died already, the heart stopped pumping, but there's still lots of blood in that bird, then in that case, it's not sufficient to salt the entire bird, but rather we have to cut the bird into pieces, and the bird has to be salted in individual pieces. Okay. We're going to continue now with maybe part of the most important aspect of shechita. There are 5 specific things that cause a shechita to become invalid. Okay, besides all the other things I said to you, there are 5 things that we do during the shechita, the actual procedure, that if you do one of these things, the animal is not kosher. These you're going to have to remember them in Hebrew, and I'm going to say their names in Hebrew. Shehia, Drisa, Chalada, Hagrama, Ve'ikur. You have to remember those 5 things. Shehia means a pause. Once you start slaughtering, you're not allowed to start, stop, and then continue back again. You can go back and forth 100 times. You can do it all day long, the Talmud says, but you can't stop in the middle. That's Shehia. Drisa means pressure. You can't put pressure down. You can't chop it. Like if I just chop the head off or just even chopped and it cut the vessels, that's insufficient. You're not allowed to put pressure. You just have to use a slight back and forward motion with the slightest bit of pressure so that the knife can go through. So that's the second one. Shia Drisa Chalada. What's Chalada? Chalada means that instead of cutting from the outside going in, I stick the knife in the side and cut out, okay? Along with that goes not being able to see the knife. So if you're dealing with an animal that has, let's say, lots of hair here, so you have to wash that hair away. Or if you're looking at a bird that's very, very fluffy, you want to put a little bit of water there so you can see the area, and that the knife doesn't disappear into all the fluff or the hair, or if there's lots of feathers there. One thing that people used to do is sometimes they would pluck some of those feathers so they could see the neck very clearly. The problem is that that causes a drop of bleeding. And since we're concerned, even though it's a bit of a stretch, but we're concerned that possibly by you're looking at doing some damage, making a little hole in, let's say, the food pipe. If you remember, we have what's called a treifa. Treifa is one of the things that makes an animal unkosher because of a physical problem, and a hole in the veshet, in the food pipe, is one of them. So therefore, as a result, we try not to pluck. So that's shehia, hesitation. Drisa is putting pressure on. Chalada is sort of cutting from the back forward, okay? Shia Drisa Chalada Hagrama. Hagrama is cutting too high or too low, and we discussed that already. And Ikur means instead of cutting, I'm yanking, and I yank the two vessels or the two tubes, I yank it out of the head. So again, Shehia is hesitation. Drisa is pressure. Chalada means that I've hidden it in the fur, or I've stuck it inside here and I can't see it and I'm cutting out. Shia Drisa Chalada Hagrama means I cut above or below the sufficient place, the proper location. And Ikur means I've ripped it out. Now, these are the 5 most important things, okay? This is definitely going to be on your test. You need to remember them. And since I'm telling you it's going to be on the test, and since I'm telling you that you have to remember them, if somebody comes to that test and they don't know these 5 things and they can't explain it, both the Hebrew name and in English, you failed the test. So I'm giving you that warning now. We say that, in fact, it's such an important thing that the Code of Jewish Law says any shochet that does not know these laws, this is what he says, he actually calls them, these are the laws of Shechita. Okay? And if you don't know these, it's forbidden to eat from a shechita, and here they are: shehia, drisa, chalada, hagrama, ve'ikur. Okay? So even the slightest hesitation is not considered to be kosher, and therefore, if you see even the slightest hesitation, it's not kosher. Now, the problem is what happens when you're holding the bird wrong and you cut your fingers, okay? Even if you think that you didn't do a hesitation, if you cut your fingers, there's going to be a minor hesitation, and therefore it's not kosher. And in fact, very often, if somebody will take a video of you while you're shechting, like I've had students that have shechted, they put the knife down, they did it, and they stop, and then they continue, and they'll swear that they didn't do any shehiyah. They'll swear that no, I didn't stop. But when you show them the video, they see it. Okay, we will continue next time. This is, I think it's the 5th of probably 7 videos, and with that you will have the information that you need to start practicing and learning how to prepare the knife. Look forward to seeing you. Bye-bye.